Hey everybody, it's Randy Ray. I am back. I got out of the hospital just a couple of days ago. Took a couple of days to rest so that I wouldn't have the personality of a soggy piece of toast for these videos. And now that I've settled in here at Driftwood Ranch, it's time for me to talk about books. And I hope you're going to talk about books in the comments too, because I hate to talk alone. I thought it would be interesting since Pope Francis died this morning, and he was one of the more interesting popes, to discuss some of the things that made him who he was. Particularly, which books did he like? What books did he read? What did he pour into his head that helped make him who he was? I read an article, I don't remember who wrote it, I don't remember how long ago it was, that said you can have any mentor that you want, especially if it's a writer or a reader, if you just find out what they read and what they write, and then you absorb all of it. Now, that doesn't automatically turn you into Pope Francis, for example. But if you've read most of what was important to him and everything that he's written, let's say you're able to get copies of the sermons that he preached or the homilies that he delivered, you're going to come within distance of understanding who he is and how he thinks, to the point where you might ask him a question, even though he's not present. You might ask him a question and know what the answer would be, just because you've absorbed so much. So, let's talk just a second about Pope Francis. He was born in 1936, the same age as my dad. So, Daddy died 5 years ago. So, Pope Francis must have been in his 90s, maybe 91, something like that. But he was the 266th Pope of the Catholic Church. And from 2013 until 2025, he was the Pope. So he's been Pope for the last 12 years. He was the first Jesuit Pope. And we know from Steve Donahue, the Jesuits do some pretty serious reading. I also know that because I had a college instructor who was trained as a Jesuit. And that was some serious learning going on in his class. Pope Francis was also the first Pope we had from the Americas, and he's the first non-European pontiff in over 1,000 years. So, and he was raised in a family of Italian immigrants, worked as a chemical technician, briefly was a janitor. At age 21, he got really sick and had to have part of his lung removed. In 1958, he entered the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, and was ordained a priest in 1969. So 11 years as a monk in the Society of Jesus would make you pretty smart. And a companion video for this that might be interesting would be to see what do Jesuits read as a general part of their curriculum. This particular video is all about specific books, stories, and other literature that Pope Francis read. But that was stuff that was specific to him. What do all the Jesuits read? Because that's got to be a part of his background too. That's part of what made Pope Francis who he was also. But he was elevated to cardinal in 2001 by Pope John Paul II. Pope John Paul II has a special place in my family's hearts because he was the first Polish Pope. And as you could probably tell from my sexy thick lips and big nose, I'm Polish. So, but anyway, I'm not going to go too much more into details about his career as the Pope. That information is readily available. In fact, if you clicked on this video, you're probably aware of and admire Pope Francis already. And if you don't, maybe you can find something to admire about him. Take a look online and do some reading. But I want to get into Pope Francis's 10 favorite books, and I want to get into them right away. The first book on my list of Pope Francis' favorite books was The Betrothed by Alessandro Manzoni. And I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. I'm not Italian. But this is an Italian classic. I believe it was written around 1907. We know that Pope Francis loved this novel. It was one of his favorites. He read it multiple times. He often quoted it in his homilies, especially during the pandemic. And he would draw parallels between the themes of that novel and contemporary challenges like what we had during the COVID. So let's see here, The Betrothed. You can find that fairly affordably on Amazon. I believe it was published in 1907, but you can get You can get it on Kindle for next to nothing, but you can also get it in the Penguin edition for like $13, which is pretty standard for a Penguin edition these days. I like paper books, Dead Tree editions. They're my favorites. Unfortunately, my vision is having some problems. I'm going to see a doctor about it soon. But my vision problems make it really hard for me to see a piece of paper and read on it. So I've been reading a lot of ebooks lately, which is why I don't have a stack of paper books to hold up and show you for this video, because most of these I downloaded onto my Kindle. The next on the list, number 2 of Pope Francis's top 10 novels, is Lord of the World by Robert Hugh Benson. This one looks really interesting to me. It's a dystopian novel that Pope Francis frequently recommended. He saw it as a prophetic depiction of secularism and ideological colonization, and he urged on readers to reflect on its warnings. So when I think of a dystopian novel, I'm thinking of things like 1984. I'm thinking of things like, that's the H.G. Wells novel, but I'm also thinking of things like The Stand and Swan Song. So one of these, written from the perspective of someone who's a devout Catholic, and Robert Hugh Benson was a devout Catholic, is really interesting. He was an Anglican priest, and he wrote Lord of the World 2 years after he converted to Roman Catholicism, 1903. And let's see, something else interesting. I'm looking this stuff up online. I have notes over here on my computer open in multiple tabs, but some of them are interesting, some of them aren't. I do want to talk about the plot just a little bit, because the plot sounds interesting. In early 21st century London, the priests Percy Franklin and John Francis visit the elderly Mr. Templeton, a Catholic and former conservative member of Parliament, who witnessed the marginalization of his religion and the destruction of his party. Templeton describes to the two priests the last century of British and world history. Now, of course, this is set in the future, but it's set in the future from them. The British Empire is now a single-party state. The British royal family has been deposed, the House of Lords abolished, and Oxford and Cambridge universities closed down. Marxism, atheism, and secular humanism dominate culture and politics. The Church of England has been disestablished, and like all forms of Protestantism is almost extinct. The world now has only 3 main religious forces: Catholicism, secular humanism, and the Eastern religions. The world has been divided into 3 power blocks: the European Confederation of Marxist one-party states and their colonies in Africa, the Eastern Empire, whose emperor descends from the Japanese and Chinese imperial families, and the American Republic, consisting of North and South America. The European Confederation and Eastern Empire are now on the brink of war. And that's just the prologue, okay? That's just the backstory. So there's some world building going on here that looks pretty interesting. You can probably imagine where it goes from here. I'm not going to read more of this because I don't want to spoil the plot at all, but let's just say the Antichrist is a figure in this story. Spoiler alert, I did it, I spoiled it. The Antichrist shows up, which is unusual in one of these novels. But yeah, so anyway, that one might be the most interesting of the 10 favorite books of Pope Francis. That's definitely going on my to-be-read list. I'm thinking about, and I don't know if I'm going to do this or not, but there's 10 books here. I'm thinking about maybe setting aside 2 weeks and just reading Pope Francis's to-be-read list, this 10-item list. They all look that interesting. The next 2, okay, so that was number 1, number 2. 3 and 4, okay, are the Brothers Karamazov, is number 3, and Notes from the Underground is number 4. Those were both written by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Pope Francis admired Dostoevsky's exploration of human nature and spirituality, and he often referenced both of those works when he talked about faith and morality. These are famous enough books that if you're watching a channel like mine, which is about books, which occasionally touches on classic books, you will have heard of the Brothers Karamazov and Notes from the Underground, even if you haven't read them yet. For that matter, I've heard of the Brothers Karamazov and Notes from the Underground, even though I haven't read them yet. But they're perennially on my to-do list. I mean, I have no aversion to reading them. Just haven't gotten to them yet. My to-be-read list is basically my entire house. There's bookshelves on every wall, and there are unread books on every bookshelf. That's just how it is here. So that was number 3 and number 4. Number 5 is a book called The Lord by Romano Guardini. That sounds Italian to me. I wouldn't swear to it. As a theologian, Guardini's writings significantly influenced Pope Francis. He praised the Lord for its insightful portrait of Jesus' life and teachings. So this one is another telling of the life of Christ in a historical context, but also including the psychology behind his physical being and spirit. Unlike other books seeking to strip Jesus' story to reveal only the human being, the Lord gives the complete story of Jesus Christ as man, Holy Ghost, and Creator. Pope Benedict XVI lauds Guardini's work as providing a full understanding of the Son of God, away from the prejudice that rationality engenders. Put long-held myths aside and discover the entire truth about God's only begotten Son. That sounds like something I would enjoy reading, although there is a possibility I might have trouble swallowing some of the quote-unquote literal truth engaged in here. I generally don't believe in quote-unquote the supernatural or the miracles. I think that there's much truth in the Bible, but I don't think metaphorical truth is somehow less important than literal truth. And a lot of your Christians, especially in my part of the country, insist that literal truth is what we're talking about here rather than metaphorical truth. And they get very angry about the difference. So I might have a hard time relating to that one. I don't know. But it still sounds interesting enough to read. Okay, so that was number 5. Number 6 is The Return of the Prodigal Son by Henri J.M. Nouwen. And I guarantee you I'm mispronouncing that one. If anybody wants to correct my pronunciation in their own response video to this, please feel free. Please, for that matter, if you can figure out how to write the pronunciation in the comments below, please do that there. This reflective work resonated with Pope Francis's emphasis on mercy and compassion. Now, there are two things about Christianity that I can get behind: mercy and compassion. The return of the prodigal son. And of course, the prodigal son is my favorite of the parables. A chance encounter with a reproduction of Rembrandt's The Return of the Prodigal Son, it's a painting, catapulted Henri Nouwen on an unforgettable spiritual adventure. Here he shares the deeply personal and resonant meditation that led him to discover the place within where God has chosen to dwell. So this isn't a novel, it's only 150 pages, but it looks like more of a memoir about the author's experience becoming enlightened, Christianitized, or, saved, however you want to put it. Looks interesting to me. And then that was number... I used to know how to count. That was number 6. This is number 7. The Garden of Forking Paths by Jorge Luis Borges. Now this one's interesting because Borges was a short story writer and he was a known agnostic, but he also was one of Pope Francis's school teachers at one point. And they had enormous respect for each other's intellect, even though they had big differences in terms of their belief systems. This particular short story by Borges has to do with alternate realities. And at the time, alternate realities and quantum reality was not something that people talked about all the time. It's something people talk about all the time now, there's no doubt about it. But this was kind of the beginning of that. So Pope Francis really liked him, though. He even invited him to speak to a bunch of students during his time teaching school himself. So not only did Borges teach Pope Francis, but he taught Pope Francis his classes when Francis was teaching literature, which I think is really cool. I'm sure it's included in... Borges has one big book that's a collection of everything he ever wrote, and I'm sure The Garden of Forking Paths is included in there. So I have a copy of that in my room, but I didn't think to bring it in here for the video. I probably should have, because then I could hold it up, but if wishes were horses, dreamers would ride, wouldn't they? And so, finally, okay, the final 3 books, 8, 9, and 10, are really one big book. And you probably know where I'm going with this because it's a book that I love so much. The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien insists that The Lord of the Rings is one novel, not a trilogy, even though it's published as 3 separate books. And it was published as 3 separate books for the most prosaic of reasons. You couldn't put that much paper in one big book. It would fall apart. It would be unwieldy. You wouldn't be able to read it. So they divided it into 3 books, each of which was then divided into halves. So really there's 6 books, but there's the first one is the Fellowship of the Ring, the second one is the Two Towers, and then the final book in the not trilogy, quote unquote, is the Return of the King. But Pope Francis was a fan because of Bilbo and Frodo, because they had a journey of hope and they lived through a battle between good and evil. And here we're talking about, again, metaphorical truth. Okay? Obviously, it's a story. And Bilbo and Frodo are hobbits, But I will be surprised if you go into The Lord of the Rings with an open mind, if you haven't read it before, or even if you haven't read it before and you didn't really like it last time, if you go into it with an open mind and think, what can I get out of this? How does this affect my life? How does this apply to me? I think if you go into it with that attitude, you're going to come away with one of the most significant reading experiences of your life. And I think Pope Francis certainly recognized that. But yeah, Tolkien's an author worth reading. You could probably skip all this other stuff like the Silmarillion. Then, you've got these, like the Hobbit movies. They made a trilogy out of what was essentially one small book that wasn't even as big as one of the 3 sections of The Lord of the Rings. And then I didn't watch that. I watched the first one, but it wasn't very good because it was just a money grab, And then they're making a show called The Rings of Power on Amazon. Season 3 is coming up in a few months, but it has really nothing to do with Tolkien's works. I'm surprised they managed to talk Tolkien's son into selling the rights to it to make the show. I guess, you put enough money on the table and even Christopher Tolkien's gonna bat an eye at it. But yeah, the Peter Jackson movies are terrific, especially the extended versions, but nothing compares to the actual books. And luckily, we're reading those books later this year. I believe we have them scheduled for November. We're going to read the Lord of the Rings in November as part of the Lone Star Book Club. And I've been accused of picking a book that's way too long to read in 1 month, which is true. I have done that. But if you're paying attention to the schedule, you'll also notice that aside from the Lord of the Rings, in December, we're only reading 2 stories, and they're short stories. One is A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, which I feel like everybody should read every Christmas because it's marvelous. And we're going to read what's even shorter, O. Henri and The Gift of the Magi, which I've read to my daughters every year at Christmas time, even now. Of course, now that they're a little older, they're not as likely to want to listen to it. Which is really bizarre to me because it's so short. It's not long at all. And they usually get a kick out of me when I cry during any kind of media. Anytime I get sentimental, my daughters just get a big kick out of it. When we watch It's a Wonderful Life, I've seen It's a Wonderful Life, I don't know how many times on how many Christmases, but I start crying as soon as the movie starts. And I'll just cry straight through the movie all through the end. And I remember the first time my daughters watched it with me, they'd said no for I don't know how long because I've been pushing them hard to watch it. And you know how kids are, they're just contrary. But I was watching, and I started crying almost immediately, and I saw Mary look over at Maddie and whisper, "Hey, Maddie, look." And she points at me, and I'm over there crying. And Maddie, the real mouthy one, "Why are you crying? Nothing's even happened yet, Dad." And so I put it on pause, and I said, "You don't understand. This movie reminds me of every Christmas I've ever lived through." And that's 55 years of Christmases now. And you don't know it, but I've had 20 Christmases with you guys. But I had 20 Christmases as a child with my parents too. And then I had Christmases with other women whose children I helped raise when I was a bachelor. And I've got all kinds of family who have died that I no longer get to see at Christmas. So you ask me why I'm crying during It's a Wonderful Life, even though nothing has happened yet. You guys are wrong. Something has happened, quite a bit. And it happened a long time ago, and it keeps happening, and it's going to continue to happen until I'm gone. And it's going to happen after I'm gone too. So I'm going to wrap this video about Pope Francis's top 10 favorite books up. But you know what? May he rest in peace. I think he did the office of the papacy well. You know, I'm not a Catholic. I have friends who are Catholic, many of whom I admire very much. And like I said, I think he did well. And don't know, and I'm not entirely confident that whoever replaces him will be able to live up to the example that he set. Oh, and before I go, be back soon. Thanks for watching, but be back soon because I've got more about the Lone Star Book Club that I'm going to be posting this week. And I want to remind you to stay hydrated because it's so very important. And also stay sexy because you never know when that's going to come in handy, right? Anyway, I'll see you soon, and thanks for watching.